Hey guys, tonight, we're going to drift back into a world where dinner was mostly gruel. Your boss was a sword-wielding landlord, and the Black Death was basically your nosy neighbor who wouldn't stop dropping by uninvited. So, dim the lights, get comfortable, and prepare for the oddly cozy history of how medieval peasants managed to not only survive plagues, famine, and lords, but also somehow keep the whole feudal system running while doing it. Let's be honest. If history was a big, dramatic stage play, the peasants were the background extras. You didn't get lines, you didn't get costumes, you just stood there digging dirt while the king posed in velvet tights. But without peasants, the system collapses. The castles don't get their bread, the lords don't get their rents, and the church doesn't get their tenth of everything, including, weirdly, chickens. Now, imagine you're a medieval peasant. Your house is made of mud and straw, which sounds rustic in a Pinterest way, but mostly just meant drafty winters and a smell that never really left the walls. Your diet is bread, more bread, and, if you're lucky, onions. If you were really lucky, you had an ale brewed from whatever random grains didn't rot in storage. Bon appetit. Then came the famines. One bad harvest and suddenly it's not just your bread that's gone. It's everyone's bread. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317? Absolute disaster. Rain ruined crops, livestock starved, and people resorted to eating bark, roots, and, let's just say, creative things that weren't exactly Michelin star approved. Chroniclers even whispered about cannibalism. But let's just imagine some sad soup made of weeds and move along. And then, as if empty stomachs weren't enough, along came the plagues. The Black Death hit in the 14th century like a particularly rude houseguest and decided to wipe out about a third to half of Europe. If you survived, congratulations. But don't celebrate too quickly. You probably still had fleas, rashes, and a landlord knocking at your door asking for rent on a field you could barely plow. Speaking of landlords, the lords. These guys were basically your subscription plan to survival, except you couldn't cancel. You worked their land, you gave them a share of your crops, you paid fees to use the lord's mill, the lord's oven, even sometimes the lord's winepress. And if you thought, maybe I'll just ignore him, well, armed knights tend to make a pretty convincing argument. But here's the weird twist. As much as peasants were squeezed dry, they were also stubbornly resilient. Community was survival. Families worked together, villages pulled resources, and every festival, no matter how small, was seized as an excuse to eat, drink, and pretend, briefly, that lords and plagues didn't exist. They also leaned on religion, not just because priests promised heaven, but because faith made sense of the chaos. If your entire family died of a fever, well, clearly it was God's will. And if your cow miraculously survived, also God's will. It was a tidy explanation system that required no antibiotics. So how did peasants survive? By lowering expectations to nearly zero, clinging to each other, and making peace with the fact that your best day might simply be one where your bread didn't mold and your landlord forgot to collect taxes. But of course, history being history, things got complicated. Because the very disasters that nearly wiped peasants out also gave them rare moments of power. Let's float gently into that next thought. How famine and plague accidentally shook up the whole peasant-lord dynamic. So here's the irony. While famine and plague were tragic, they sometimes tilted the scales in peasants' favor. Picture this. Half the village has died of disease, but the fields are still there. The lords still need rent, and suddenly, there aren't enough hands to do the work. Supply and demand, medieval edition. Fewer peasants meant each surviving one was just a bit more valuable. It's the first time lords had to actually negotiate. Shocking, I know. In England after the Black Death, for instance, peasants started asking for higher wages. And not politely either, they knew their worth. Some even abandoned their home villages altogether, moving to places that offered better terms. Think of it like the medieval version of job hopping. Of course, the lords hated this. They preferred their peasants poor, obedient, and nailed to the land like decorative scarecrows. So governments rushed in with laws to freeze wages and keep people where they were. The Statute of Laborers in 1351 basically said, nope, you can't earn more than before, even if everyone else is dead, which went over about as well as you'd expect. Naturally, when you push peasants too far, revolts start brewing. The most famous in England was the Peasants' Revolt of 1381. It was less a polished revolution and more a collective tantrum about unfair taxes, corrupt officials, and the never-ending squeeze from above. They marched, they shouted, they demanded change. Spoiler, most revolts failed in the long run, but for a brief, chaotic moment, peasants remembered they had voices and sometimes pitchforks. But here's the thing. Even without revolts, survival meant adaptation. Villages leaned on communal practices. Shared fields, common grazing lands, and everyone pitching in to repair roads or churches. It wasn't exactly voluntary, but it kept society glued together. And when disaster struck, the village collective was your insurance plan. Daily survival was also about creativity. Bread might have been the staple, but peasants supplemented with pottage, a kind of thick stew where you tossed in whatever you could scavenge. Beans, peas, leeks, maybe a little bacon if the pig hadn't already been sold to pay taxes. For flavoring, herbs and wild greens filled the gap when spices were reserved for kings and monasteries. And ale, always ale, because water was often unsafe, and let's face it, a little buzz made plowing fields slightly more tolerable. Social life, too, was surprisingly important. Festivals, holy days, and seasonal rituals gave structure to an otherwise grim existence. May Day meant dancing and greenery. Harvest festivals meant relief and, briefly, full bellies. These weren't luxuries, they were lifelines for mental survival. Because if you're stuck farming a lord's land in endless mud, you need at least one day to laugh, drink, and watch someone fall off a hobby horse. Religion tied all of it together. The church was everywhere. Physically, financially, psychologically. You paid tithes, you confessed sins, and you believed that if you suffered enough now, there was eternal bliss waiting later. It sounds bleak, but it also gave peasants a reason to carry on. When famine struck, priests told them to pray harder. When plague arrived, processions filled the streets. And when lords demanded taxes, the church often backed them, because why not double down? Yet despite all of this pressure, peasants endured. Their resilience wasn't heroic in the modern sense. It was quiet, repetitive, and deeply communal. A rhythm of toil, loss, and small joys, year after year. So, the next time you hear about kings, queens, and their glittering courts, remember the peasants. They were the backbone of the whole messy system, surviving plagues, famine, and lords by sheer persistence, and occasionally by knowing when to quietly bend or when to loudly resist. And that, dear listeners, is the sleepy saga of medieval peasant survival. Not glamorous, not glorious, but oddly comforting, in its own muddy, bread-scented way.